Ladies and gentlemen, hi. Thanks for joining us. Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel. And I wanted to mention right off the top that as we are taping this, we are going to bring you a very timely topic. And as we tape this, it is just the day after Robert Mueller has released his report, in which arguably we have had somewhat of a coup. At least that's what some people, including Lindsey Graham, is arguing, somewhat of a coup to get rid of Donald Trump as the President of the United States, and that was coordinated behind the scenes. And so there is an increasing fear among some in political circles that while we think that we the people are running our democracy and we the people are donating in our donations to political parties, Republicans or Democrats, that sometimes behind the scene, very big money people are pulling the levers of power, the dark money, it is said. And we are going to be joined today by someone who just wrote a book on this topic. Jeff Reynolds is joining us from Portland, Oregon. And Jeff is the author of Behind the Curtain. Jeff, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you, Terry. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
What can you tell us, as I said, apparently, or from what your book is about, and I will admit that I haven't had the opportunity as yet to read it. I believe it was just published in February. Is that correct?
Yeah, February 26th was the release date.
But it came to our attention, and we thought this was a very good time to bring this up. As I loosely understand the theme of the book, it is there are some very big moneyed people behind the scenes who are doing more than just donating to candidates. They're influencing our elections, and not just the elections, but just influencing our entire political process. George Soros is a name that a lot of people might be familiar with, but I think you would argue that he is just one of a number of people who are engaged in such activities, and these activities are altering the political landscape as we have known it heretofore. Is that the gist of it?
That's exactly right. And what we're seeing is the resistance to Donald Trump has been coordinated by some of the biggest players on the left. You talk about George Soros. You talk about Tom Steyer, who's been pushing for impeachment real hard, and he continues to push for impeachment. But you got people like Michael Bloomberg, and then some lesser known folks like Herb Sandler and the Sackler family and the Ford Foundation. All these giant foundations on the left as well. And so what happened is with the resistance, this whole thing started at a conference for donors that was held on inauguration weekend. So David Brock of Media Matters and 21st Century Bridge Pack brought all these people together to plan out how they were going to resist Donald Trump and make him appear that he was so toxic and so not normal that they would not allow him to be normalized for the mainstream public. And so they actually called this whole plan the plan to kick Donald Trump's butt. And they have this 40-page document. The Washington Free Beacon actually attended the conference and was able to get a copy of the document, and they plotted out. I mean, it's all there on paper.
Does your book just concern the influence on Trump, or does it also David Brock and Media Matters have been around long before Donald Trump even announced for
Sure.
president? At what point does your book kind of pick up on where the influence of the so-called dark money has been felt?
Well, it goes back, honestly, it goes back to the 60s and even before that. So you've got, I'll give you one example, the Ford Foundation. A lot of people are familiar with the billionaires, but they're not familiar with all these large foundations that give charitable donations to, it's generally supposed to be directed towards making, charitable causes that make people's lives better. But what ends up happening is the boards of directors have gotten progressively more liberal over the decades, and now they're giving to all these radical environmental groups and the Southern Poverty Law Center and those types of folks that are pushing a radical leftist narrative that's counter to American culture. So the Ford Foundation is my favorite example. This was started by Henry Ford himself 70 or 80 years ago, and they have assets in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And the last surviving member of the Ford family, Henry Jr., left the Ford Foundation in the 70s, and he wrote a scathing letter that I quote in my book, stating that he was leaving the foundation and that they've abandoned the principles of free market capitalism that allowed them to amass this wealth in the first place, and they're actually working to undermine American society, and that he would have no more of it. So that's just one foundation. There are dozens and dozens of these foundations with that kind of wealth to spread around and push these radical agendas.
People who are going to be listening to this are going to be saying, now hang on a minute, why are you just saying the radical left? Because we have the Koch brothers and big corporations that give money to conservative causes. So should we be looking at both sides, or are you, do you have a political axe to grind? Are you attacking the left through your book, or are you looking at the political landscape?
Well, I'm an unabashed Tea Party conservative, so that's the angle I come from. But I would argue also that it's rather hypocritical of the left to talk about billionaires in politics when the amount of money on their side far outstrips the amount of money on our side. We are constantly bashed as the party of billionaires and beholden to dark money, but they're pulling all sorts of tricks to hide their money, to move it around. There's foreign influence. The Chinese and the Russians have been infiltrating leftist causes since the 50s and 60s to undermine stability in America. So it really, there's a vast network of this stuff, and the stuff on the right really doesn't even compare. The top 20 billionaires that are listed on opensecrets.org who are donors to political campaigns, the 18 of those 20 billionaires are give exclusively to the left. Only 2 of them give exclusively to the right.
And you touched on something that is the reason why we wanted to talk to you today, because when we look at the so-called Russian collusion, while that has been apparently disproven,
well, at least on one side.
Well, at least by the investigation of Mueller. On the other hand, the fear and the concern, let's say, is that we as Americans are not going to be free of outside influence. It should be that as we vote as Americans, that whether you're left or right, we run our elections, we run our democracy, and we don't want to have surreptitious, behind-the-scene influence, whether it's from Vladimir Putin or the Chinese or someone else distorting. And we have the whole idea of fake news and people purposely putting out propaganda. The idea of democracy at its core is that we're going to be making decisions in self-government based upon factual information. And there's certainly going to be disagreements. There always have been different interpretations. But if we have the influence of foreign governments or some people who gain undue influence, Eisenhower, in his farewell address, talked about the undue influence of the military-industrial complex, that they would be putting too much power on the federal government to be spending more and more money on armaments so that they become wealthy. Am I right that when you talk I think in your book a bit about the Antifa movement, and we should again point out that you are from Portland, Oregon, which is one of the, while you're a conservative, you're one of the most liberal towns in America. And I think, am I right that that is also the birthplace of the Antifa movement? Is that correct?
It's West Coast. There are a couple of different pods, and there's a little bit of history there. It goes back to the 1990s and the WTO riots in Seattle. But those are anarchists from Eugene actually started that whole thing, and then it sort of evolved into Antifa. But make no mistake about it, this is all coordinated too. Antifa and their affiliated groups also get funding from these foundations, the Tides Foundation and all these other groups, so it's not like this is just some organic thing that sprung up and all of a sudden people hate a democracy and
yeah, let me jump
free
in just
markets.
if I might, because this is I'm just trying to still frame the argument so people go, well, what are you guys talking about? Whether the viewer wants to accept it or not, the argument that you're making in your book Behind the Curtain is that a group like Antifa, as you said, is not just an organic uprising of people. It is something, and we see these caravans all of a sudden on the southern border of so many people from Central America, which wasn't happening in years past. We have
Nope.
different things happening, and so people begs the question, I should say, well, how is this coming about? What's causing this? And so we
Right.
have all of this coordination of someone like a George Soros who's giving money to some of these groups like a Media Matters and a number of other ones, probably half of which I've not even heard of. But the point is that this wealth is not just donating a check to an individual candidate, but they are funding groups to constantly push our political process either to the left or to the right. Now, my friends on the left would say the Koch brothers are doing this as well, and that they also are having an undue influence on American politics. I suppose the point I would make in an umbrella statement is that, and what I'm trying to get over this interview, is that this is happening. And I think people are not recognizing it, maybe to the extent that it is happening, that we might still have somewhat of a naive view as Americans that, we listen to a commercial, we go hear a guy talk or a gal talk as a candidate, we maybe give them $50 and then we vote for him, and that's the end of it. But increasingly, whether it's from Vladimir Putin or others, there's just all kinds of other influences out there, and many of these people, as you say in your book, are behind the curtain. So I just wanted to make sure we gave the overall theme as to
Yeah,
what this is
and
about.
that makes me think of another example of something that people are just ignorant of. They don't realize. So I'll give you an example. The Pew Charitable Trusts. Most people think of Pew as a polling outfit that's well regarded, that does political polling and polling on issues of national interest. Right? They don't realize how vast the foundation is, the Pew Charitable Trusts that is behind this. So Pew has this benign sort of well-liked public image, but they also have this foundation that's giving tens of millions of dollars a year to radical leftist organizations and pushing a radical agenda. And that's in coordination with other folks like the Southern Poverty Law Center, ProPublica. ProPublica is another good example of an organization that is specifically set up to do investigative journalism and to teach journalists how to report the news, but they do it from a far left angle, and that's really what's shaping a lot of the news that we see. And we complain all the time about the leftist bias in the mainstream media, and a lot of it comes from places like ProPublica and Pew Charitable Trusts, and I talk about that in the book as well.
So how did you come to, and I tell you, I want to ask you how you came to write the book, but first, why don't you give us a little background on who is Jeff Reynolds?
Okay, so I was completely uninvolved in politics until the Tea Party movement, 2008, 2009. I saw the guy that was going to get elected, and I started getting concerned that he was going to make good on his promise to fundamentally change America. So I went from completely uninvolved to, being an activist, being the chair of my local county Republican Party, getting involved in state level, getting involved in campaigns, running for office. I really wanted to do something to change things. And so along the way, I also got to be fairly well known as a writer and a blogger. And now I write at PJ Media. I write for the Heartland Institute on tax and budget issues and healthcare issues. I've gone from completely uninvolved to sucked into the vortex. And along the way, I discovered that I have a knack for writing. So here I am.
And as we as we look at what's going on, well, first of all, when you say well, let me just go. So you with that background, you just recently wrote the book. Why did you write the book, and what research did you do to back up the claims that you're making?
So I wanted to write the book because it struck me as very hypocritical by folks on the left who constantly complain about the dark money on the right and calling the Republican Party the beholden to billionaires and the party of billionaires. So I wanted to expose how much dark money they have on their side. And I really didn't even get to document it all. I really just kind of hit the treetops. It's a primer, so there's so much there that it defies a effort to catalog it all. So I wanted to give a lot of good examples, good media examples of, this is what they're doing. And, it was an incredible process, frankly, because every time my publisher and I were set on a set of chapters and a narrative that we were going to do, some other news would break, and we're like, oh, we got to put that in the book too. And so it took a long time to put the narrative together into something that was coherent, because news kept breaking and we kept seeing things come out that was even more outrageous than the last issue. So it really took a while for me to kind of figure out how to put the pieces together.
I'm going to guess that you, being in Portland, Oregon, you probably have some friends who are on the left side of the political spectrum. Did you run this by them? Did you try to be fair in this book, or was this written from the standpoint merely of someone who's a member or was a member of the Tea Party?
Well, I go back to what Andrew Breitbart said. The truth isn't mean; it's the truth. I didn't. Yes, I come at it from a perspective of a conservative who wanted to examine the dark money on the left. Fairness wasn't really part of the equation. I suppose I could write a book next on what's going on the right. My brother actually asked me about that. He and I don't agree on very much. And, I wanted to get this book out there to explore this issue of dark money on the left with the Soroses and the Steyers and the Bloombergs and all of those folks. So maybe the next one will be one on the right. But this was the one that really got me fired up, because I've been watching this stuff for years, and so much of what's said there's so much that they know that isn't so.
And so, what is it that isn't so from your perspective?
From my perspective, what I would say is that as Republicans, we're constantly being accused of taking Koch money, taking money from billionaires, and doing things that only help billionaires make more money. And really, honestly, it's the opposite is true. I suppose both sides are in the same category, right? The establishment Republicans have their groups of people that they support, but the Democrats are not for the little guy. That's really what I'm trying to get across here, is that the Democrats claim that they're for the middle class and poor folks, and nothing could be further from the truth. I remember reading this story about Bill Clinton at a fundraiser in Southern California, and it was this guy who's a big donor down there in somewhere in San Diego County, and he lives on this cliff overlooking the ocean, and he has this pet bird, a macaw or something, that everybody at this fundraiser party was feeding berries to this bird. And I just thought, that's about the most elitist thing I've ever heard, so I wanted to sort of remove the veneer of this claim that they're for the little guy, and really expose the fact that they're the elites, and they actually want to create an elite class. And that's really when you get down to it, socialism, communism, Marxism cannot work without an elite ruling class, and that's really what they're pushing for.
The interest that I predominantly had is I think people ought to know that there are other forces at work, and I don't want to make it sound merely just from one standpoint, although I appreciate your coming at it from the Republican standpoint. But
Sure.
you do mention in your book, you were kind enough to send me some of the galleries so I could read get a flavor of it. But you were talking about in Portland there, where they have had a parade going on for years, but then Antifa was threatening to bring out like 200 people if I think a conservative or the Republican float wasn't removed from the parade. And so that is the point that it seems to me, whether you're on the left or right, what's happening is that you have these outside people and influences trying to shut down the standard way that American democracy is practiced. I mean, if the Democrats want to have a float in the parade, fine. If the Republicans want to have a float in the parade, fine. But when we have, as we have seen in your example, and I'll let you go into it, but we've also seen around the country where if you have a speaker going to Berkeley, all of a sudden we had the Antifa people rioting and breaking windows. And we have any number of college campuses where they're being intimidated. Some people have called these Nazi tactics, where they intimidate the organization, whether it is a parade that is going to be put on, whether it is a college administration that says if you bring in this conservative speaker, we're going to shut you down. And I think you're arguing, I guess I'm trying to give the viewers, again, kind of the flavor of the book as I've read parts of it, that you're trying to say, look, this is not the standards of political behavior that we have grown up with, or that have been the history and tradition of American democracy heretofore.
Well, that's right, and it's called normalcy bias. Like, except honestly, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And so back to 2017, the local county party, I used to be chair of this party, we have an entry in this Avenue of the Roses parade in Portland, and the organizers of the parade all of a sudden started getting nervous. We've been in this parade for years, and they started getting emails from local Antifa groups saying that if they didn't kick us out of the parade, they were going to bring 200 thugs down and put the and force us out by force. They threatened violence against the parade. They said that they couldn't guarantee the safety of the parade goers or the audience. So it was a direct threat. And what ended up happening is, and this is because our city council here in Portland, very liberal Portland, is sympathetic to these people and agrees with these people. They refused to step up and allow the police to provide sufficient protection. It was really, it was shocking that they would not, and the police, I talked to the spokesman for the police bureau, and they said they had plenty of guys ready to go from the east side precinct, and they had backup from the central precinct. So they had plenty of police presence available, but the mayor and the city council refused to allow them to be deployed. So the parade organizers just canceled the parade altogether. It was stunning.
People may not remember, and I don't even remember exactly when it was, but there were some riots in downtown Portland not too long ago. Something like it. Was it a year ago, or I've lost track?
I was going to say, what time is it? It probably just happened. It happens all the time here. It's ridiculous. But there was a protest a few months back where Antifa was actually setting up no-go zones in downtown Portland. They were directing traffic and blocking cars from driving down streets where the protesters were. and telling them to drive elsewhere. So it was that bad. I mean, Antifa took over the streets, and the cops were not allowed to get them out of the streets. Every time there's a conservative demonstration, we have a March for Life, the Tea Party movement, those kinds of things. We're always confined to where we get the permits and the sidewalks, and we're never allowed to create mobs. Not that we would, but we always respect the rules. But these guys never get permits. They never work with the police. They never work with city council, and they are always blocking rights of way, getting off the sidewalks and blocking traffic. They've even, the week after down freeways, they got protesters on the freeways at night and shut them down, caused massive traffic jams at like 9 o'clock at night. It was ridiculous.
So in your book, Behind the Curtain, and the billionaires behind that, I would argue, again, one of the things that people, the viewers, should be more increasingly aware of is just the influence of big money. Now, we used to talk about the influence of big money behind the scenes in politics in terms of influencing political power or passing legislation in Congress to influence, the special interests, that maybe if it's a pharmaceutical company, they get a special tax break, or they get some other kind of a deal that they're going after, or someone else, the oil companies, etc. But the big money, and what we're talking about here, is that there are very deep pocket people, again, like a George Soros, who is not trying to enrich himself in the traditional sense of thinking about money's influence on politics, but they are trying to change through a series of behind the scene and clever ways, trying to change the course of American politics so that it follows the direction they want specifically, and that they are funding these different groups who all of a sudden, we never had all of these groups where 200 people show up and say, you better shut down this parade or else, and then they get their way. That's certainly not been the practice over time of American politics.
Yeah, I think really the main point, and by the way, I think the Soroses and the Steyers are invested heavily in green energy and that sort of thing. So they are actually looking to make a profit. So there's definitely a motivation there. But I think really the theme here is that everybody thinks of the Democrats and leftists as being motivated by sort of the little guy, grassroots. It harkens back to a view of the 60s protests that happened, and sort of a nostalgic view of how groups of people can get together and change the world. What really ends up happening is all of this is being pushed by a cabal of elites who get together and plan this stuff out. And another example of that is the Indivisible movement, which started as they wanted to create these rules and these sort of standardize how the protests were going to. And there was an article. What really spurred this whole thing was that there was an article on a website for a public radio station in Northern California, and they were talking about this Indivisible document and who was behind this document, and they talked about how it had questionable, or nobody knew who was funding them, which was kind of silly, because if you go down to the end of the bottom of the website, it actually said it was a project of the Tides Foundation, which is one of the biggest foundations on the left that's really revolutionized grant making on the left. So, but it was just kind of funny to me that it was right there on the website. But they still called it, questionable funding, or mysterious, shadowy people funding this movement, and that got me thinking. Well, what kind of shadowy funding is there? And there's a lot. There's more than anybody realizes.
Let's talk a bit about how did you do the research? What were your sources?
So I used a lot of Capital Research Center. They've done a lot of this connecting the dots between the different foundations and who's giving money to whom, and the differences between this 501c3 and a C4 and where the money's going between foundations. They move the money around a lot. There are a couple of Senate reports that I also looked into. There was one in 2014 where David Vitter actually was the chair of this minority committee that was looking into environmental grant making. And there are several organizations that are mentioned in that Senate report that are pretty shady, including Sea Change, which is a group that has 3 donors, one of which is a corporation in Bermuda that doesn't reveal its businesses or any of its dealings. So there's strong suspicion that foreign influence is coming into the environmental movement through that corporation. So there's all kinds of this stuff. Trevor Loudon has a giant database of communist influence in American society and American politics. I took from that as well. So there are a lot of sources out there. Heartland Institute has a website called the Left Exposed that has a lot more of these dots that are connected. And then, of course, I also dug up my own 990s and tried to connect the dots between who's giving money and who's taking money and who's getting grants and all of that stuff. It's the web is so vast. It's really hard to crystallize it into something. You just have to. It's so easy to get down into a rabbit hole of where this money is going that you can get lost easy.
I would say to people, and look, a lot of people are going to say, why are you putting this guy on? He's just a far right guy, and you know what? You're free to have your position just as much as anyone else, and people can accept it or reject it. But in the larger context, I do think that all of us need to just be aware of this topic and the influence of money, whether from the right or the left, on the political process, especially to the point that we have these players behind the scenes, and they don't want to come out into the light. They would rather set up these, as former Democratic Governor Pat Quinn here used to call them, the astroturf groups. Someone who is funded by someone, and so they're arguing about some point, but they're really just doing the bidding. They're kind of the financial puppets of the puppet master, someone behind the scenes with the big money. When I was with C-SPAN, and I left them about 22 years ago, but that far back, it used to be that one had to spend $6 million to have a credible campaign for the U.S. Senate 22 years ago. And that meant that for every week you were in office for 6 years, you had to raise $15,000. Well, you cannot get probably elected to a House seat these days for $6 million. A Senate seat is probably more, probably starts on the low end at about $30 to $40 million and goes up from there. So what people may not realize is that when our representatives and senators are in Washington, or even back home, they spend maybe 40 hours a week just raising money, just constantly begging for money, getting money. And sometimes, you have to say, what are the donors getting for that money?
Right.
And I think that's part of it, or I should, let me ask you, is that part of what you're saying here? And I don't know, again, because I haven't had the opportunity to read your recently published book, but do you have any solutions, or is this more just the warning shot for everyone to be aware that this is happening?
So I'm a First Amendment absolutist, and I would actually take issue with calling me far right. I'm more of a originalist constitutionalist. I'm not. I want to see us go back to our founding principles. That's my whole reason for doing all of this. And so money in politics doesn't bother me per se. money in politics, I agreed with the Citizens United ruling, and that was a strictly constitutional ruling that restored First Amendment freedoms. So I don't have a problem with money in politics as such. Now, what I have a problem with is when that money is used not to promote a particular candidate or cause. That's fine. I have no problem with that. My biggest issue is when money is used to suppress the opposition to somebody, when money is used to create straw man arguments and knock down those straw men, when you're not playing fair, when you're trying to upend the playing field, that's more of a boogeyman than he is, and to they specifically said in their memo that they are not going to allow him to be normalized for the American public. They were planning his impeachment before he even took office. So you can't tell me that this is based on the rule of law or something that they found that needed to be investigated. They were inventing things to be investigated. So that's what really bothers me, is that they never gave the guy a chance. They never wanted him to succeed. And when you don't want an American president to succeed, that means you don't want America to succeed. And that really gets under my craw. So that's why I wrote the book. And the solutions are to I'm not the biggest fan of the FEC either, the Federal Elections Commission, because as a First Amendment absolutist, I think that a lot of that stuff should be free reign. But the laws that are on the books that are being violated right now by a lot of these, foundations moving money around and donations that are being masked and foreign influence that's coming in, I think that stuff absolutely needs to be investigated and prosecuted where it's appropriate.
So, and by the way, just again today, I should say, to say how timely this is that Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican who is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said he wants an investigation into who was behind this dossier that was used to go after President Trump, who was behind in the FBI and the Department of Justice behind the FISA court applications, where
that's a big deal
alleged
too,
that they didn't give the FISA judge enough information that this dossier was funded by the Clinton campaign, and that this was apparently said to the judge. The allegations are that the judges who in the FISA court said this was said. The dossier was a legitimate intelligence gathering, and we need to know if Russia's behind us. So, Judge, we need to be able to wiretap the Trump people and their campaign because we think there's a national security threat. So, if this is as some on the Republican side are alleging, then it certainly would make the case that we have to really step back and regain control of our democratic process, because whether there is a foreign influence or whether there is unseemly influence from someone who's just some billionaire, and that's one of the points you make in the book. You have these people with immense wealth in a few hands, and that if they want to set up these organizations to do their bidding, then they can, and all of a sudden it kind of upsets the balance of power between just the standard way of doing electoral government between Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, and that's really the double standards is what really gets to me, because I think back, we talk about all this Russian collusion, but then I think back to when Barack Obama was still candidate Obama and running for president, and in June, I guess it was, of 2008, he took a trip a secret trip to go meet with the leaders of Iraq and talk to them about what he's going to do when he wins, and at the time, my friend and I were talking about this. We thought, well, that's the end of his campaign, and nothing happened, and it wasn't reported by the media, and it came out a few months before the campaign, but it barely made a ripple, and the double standards really astounds me, and that's what really I wanted to expose as well, is just this idea that when a Republican does something, it's the end of the world. When a Democrat does something, it gets swept under the rug. You look at the Clinton Foundation and all their dirty dealings. It's amazing that they continue to get away with it.
When you say some of these things, and I understand what you're saying as far as having covered some of these issues and be aware of them, but I know my friends on the Democratic side are going to take great exception to some of the points you're making. But
Sure.
on one hand, I would say the internet. Speaking of Barack Obama, and of course, we in Springfield knew Barack Obama when he was a state senator, and for years I had conversations with him when he was in the Capitol, as we see other lawmakers. But when he ran against Hillary Clinton in 2008, at first it seemed an impossible thing for someone such as himself to take on the Clinton machine, because former President Clinton had all the contacts in the Democratic Party. And so when Hillary was running in 2008, they thought, well, she will win, because you can't raise enough money to take her on. But it was the internet that allowed Barack Obama to raise millions and millions of dollars in small donations. So on one hand, whether you like Barack Obama or not, the point is the internet is one way to democratize American elections, and to have the small donors, the $20, the $10 a month kind of people, have a big influence collectively. We see this in Bernie Sanders' campaign, who again almost defeated Hillary Clinton for the nomination last time around. So there is
they had to steal it from him,
at least of American democracy. But I think the point you're making, we have to be mindful, and I would say whether it's a billionaire on the right or a billionaire on the left, we could argue about which side is more guilty of it. But to the extent that anyone with huge pockets comes in and tries to have undue influence, I think that should be something that all of us should be aware of and be more cautious about. And I think in this whole era of social media, that we have to be more careful about what are the news sources we're looking at. Are they legitimate, or is this some phony baloney group that's set up? And when we hear some study says this or some study says that, we have to say, how do I know that that's true? I mean, people could rightfully say, how do we know this Jeff Reynolds guy isn't doing the bidding of some of the Koch brothers, for God's sakes?
I have yet to get a Koch brothers check. I have never, and I used to volunteer for AFP, but I have never gotten a Koch brothers check in my life. But you could make the argument that, like a Sheldon Adelson, for instance, is a big donor to the Republican Party and to conservative causes. And in 2012, I believe it was, when Newt Gingrich was running for the nomination to take on Barack Obama, Mitt Romney ended up winning, but Newt Gingrich's campaign was kept on life support for a long time by Sheldon Adelson, almost exclusively. But then you go back and look, back the horse that you like. I'm fine with that. I thought that, even though Bernie Sanders is a far left socialist who is friendly with Marxists, you know what? If he can make his argument and make his campaign and people agree with him, then back the horse you like. What's kind of funny about that is that the Democratic Party actually had to steal the nomination make sure that the Clinton machine had their shot at Donald Trump. So, and of course, they had billions of dollars. They had a couple of $1 billion in their campaign as well. So politics is always messy. Freedom is frightening, and so as somebody who advocates for free speech and the First Amendment, that can be frightening to a lot of folks, and I don't want that to be control. I don't want that to be taken away, that freedom. What I do want everyone to know is the double standards that the left operates with. And when they say that they're for the little guy and that we're the party of the billionaires, the opposite is true.
Jeff Reynolds, before we close out, are there any final words, or where can people, if they're interested in seeing your book, where can they find it?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's Barnes & Noble also, or Simon & Schuster. Page. It's facebook.com/Jeff Reynolds author. There you can also find my podcast. I do a weekly podcast on national and local news.
Jeff Reynolds, we thank you for joining us on the Illinois channel. We appreciate you taking the time, and good luck to you in the future.
Thank you very much, Terry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.